My name is Nicholas Fernandez, and we're going to be talking about the constitutional rights within disaster policies and how they play within before disaster, during a disaster, and after. So, a little bit of background to this. These rights and laws that are created in the policy for victims and organizations is to ensure their safety and the preservation of order, mostly during a disaster and after, especially during a milling process where people don't know what's going on. So the Department of Homeland Security has established their own civil rights and civil liberties union to outline the type of procedure that any emergency responder or official needs to follow to make sure that there are no violations of these rights during a disaster. Because sometimes there's a discrepancy, and sometimes these organizations that are affected or the victims that are affected, they won't receive relief at all because of some kind of bureaucratic mistake. So that's why these laws are drafted and implemented to try and avoid these kinds of mistakes. And another group that plays a large role in establishing these laws is the American Bar Association, which has their own 12 principles, which we'll get to that later. So in the past, I can give you two examples of where there were already violations of rights after a disaster and even during. So one was in 2017 when Hurricane Harvey impacted the Texas area. There were three churches in Houston that requested aid from FEMA. Problem is that FEMA denied aid based on the grounds of the First Amendment, saying that they were violating it because they're not supposed to be involved with religion. Well, what happened is that these churches cited a case law during their lawsuit against the federal government, saying that this group, the Trinity Lutheran Church, just a year before, had also requested aid from the state to repair their playground, and they were denied on the same grounds that aid cannot be administered to a religious institution. But the ruling in that case is that if the aid is administered for non-religious purposes, then it's totally fine. And eventually, this church, about a year later in 2018, received enough aid to rebuild their three churches. Now, another example of this was in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, it was basically on federal neglect for the state-controlled territory, where their electrical system was dated, their health system was dated, and it took a very long time for aid and supplies and other officials to arrive and help the people of Puerto Rico. So the people of Puerto Rico felt like their rights were being violated because they felt neglected and that the federal government had abandoned them after such a major hurricane like Hurricane Maria. So the importance of this is that there's three main areas that the Homeland Security tries to cover during a disaster and defend their rights in these areas. And that comes down to housing, especially when you lose your home and you need aid to rebuild your home, or you need shelter temporarily, or with your family when you can't go to work or you've lost your job because your business doesn't exist anymore, or if your child can't access an education anymore because the school is gone. It is up to the responsibility of the federal government or the state government, whatever they have in their response plan, to help protect these families and organizations in achieving these areas. And there's also a financial area that they try to protect as well, which is where housing and family play in, because there are a lot of expenses to be made once a disaster impacts the area. And that's where the American Bar Association came in with their 12 principles, because basically it's an outline guiding all of these governments in their response plans to remember to always keep the rule of law, and that the Constitution is always in effect, and that there are certain aids and rights that these people and organizations have that is necessary once a disaster impacts the area. So moving forward, there needs to be public accountability in these areas, because with no public accountability, these groups that give aid to victims and organizations will never learn. And honestly, they will never figure out where are the discrepancies in their bureaucracy that is not allowing them to give aid to those who deserve it. So public accountability through the media or just through protests is very important to uphold the rule of law. Now, once a disaster impacts the area, new problems that have never been seen before can come up. And sometimes the government doesn't know how to handle these situations. So once they're resolved through legal means, these types of ideas and whatever is resolved should be implemented in an updated policy to make sure that kind of discrepancy doesn't happen again. And lastly, for all of these aid organizations, there should be education. They need an education on what are the rights of victims and organizations when they're affected by a disaster, and how to make sure to avoid violating these rights, because you don't want the embarrassment or the anger from failing to meet the needs of victims after a horrible disaster. And later on, these ideas can be implemented in their own systems. And moving forward, disaster relief from any kind of system can be further improved with efficiency and a sound protection of victims' rights. And from then on, thank you.